I started my career as a computer scientist and a neuroscientist trying to figure out why we were existing. And I thought that if I could understand the human mind, then I could understand the fundamental nature of reality. That was in about 2008, and I was getting to the point where I realized that neuroscience, while an interesting lens on reality, wouldn't tell me the fundamental nature of it. And I was also seeing the financial crisis happening, and I was looking at what jobs are available in the marketplace. I was looking at what all kinds of different people are doing. And what I started to realize was that money and what was happening in monetary theory and monetary policy all over the world, which is what was destroying a whole bunch of people's lives all over the world, was actually the basis of a part of human consciousness that I thought was broken. So this is a quote that I like to use. It's actually misattributed to Henry Ford, but it was quoted by someone, Charles Bindrup, in the House of Representatives. He said, "It is perhaps well enough that the people of the nation do not know or understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." And so the real quote is this. I won't bore you with it, but Henry Ford, he wrote this in a book about his life. He said, "The people are on the side of sound money. They're so unalterably on the side of sound money that it is a serious question how they would regard the system under which they live if they once knew what the initiate can do with it." What he's saying here is that basically we evolved money, we evolved the idea of money as a reflection of some kind of value, right? We evolved it because we need an abstraction in order to operate in our economy. But what we've done as our economy has grown, as it's become larger, as people have become experts in it, and we operate with money at a global scale, it's taken on a character that it was never really intended to work with. It was never really intended to work at the scale of a global society with people who are experts in it. And if you are a financier and you are expert in it, you can do things that most humans would not believe. And in fact, if you tell most humans how money comes into existence, they wouldn't believe you. Who in the audience feels that they know how a dollar that did not exist yesterday, say there's whatever, there's $40 trillion, that number's not exactly right, but say there's $40 trillion, now there's $40 trillion and $1 tomorrow, how did that come into existence? So some people know. So the answer is, there's a small group of humans, notably people who work for central banks, that type it in a computer, and then now there's a new dollar. And then they lend that dollar to a bank, and then that bank lends it to a normal human, and then that normal human spends their entire life working at a job that probably sucks and probably makes their consciousness not very happy and not very beautiful, and in order to pay it back to that bank, which then pays it back to that central bank. What I want to impress upon you, and there are three things I want to talk about. I want to talk about how malleable our idea of money is and how it's changed over time, how much it has to do with human consciousness, and how much it's actually a reflection of our brain, and how I think that money is an externalization of things that are already happening inside of the human mind. And then finally, I want to talk about how blockchain can change that and why it's such a powerful tool. So the word shekel, she means wheat, and kel is sort of like a bushel. It's a word that means something like bushel. And we still, in some countries, use the word shekel actually as the unit. This is a priestess, a wheat priestess, and actually in certain cultures, in Sumerian culture actually, the way money worked was you would take your bushels of wheat or your kels of wheat, and you would go deposit them at the temple, where the priestess would give you some kind of receipt essentially for them. So it literally means kel of wheat. And that wheat, the interesting property of that is that it decays over time. It goes less in value over time. Which causes people to spend it, right? If your dollar was worth half a dollar in a month, you would spend that, right? That changes how we think about reality. These are rye stones. These are giant stones in certain tribal cultures where they would go pick them up out of the ground, or they would carve them into these intricate circle structures. And the fact that someone just had one of these, it didn't even matter who was holding it. It could actually be even a stone that had fallen out of the canoe under the ground. The fact that someone knew, that society knew that you had this stone, or at one point had this stone, was all that was required. It was actually just trust. It was a community sense of trust that someone contained this value within their network. And these things are heavy. You don't want to move them very much. But if I had this thing outside my house and I want to sell it to my neighbor, all that really matters is that everyone in the community trusted me, and they trusted my neighbor, and they know that this thing transferred to someone else in the community. And I'll leave it right outside my house, actually. So we have now, as we've moved forward, thousands of years in our concept of money, is you have this really complex system. This is a diagram of kind of how central banking works. You have the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements, which are the people that kind of control how money globally works, that deal with transactions between central banks. And those central banks, as I said, lend money, which then gets levered more, and controls human consciousness. This is the flow of value of all human consciousness, from a whole bunch of anointed entities to a whole bunch of people who are basically enslaved by it. I know that's a very controversial statement, but but what I would like to do is provide tools or invite people to think about how to create tools like blockchain technology that will allow us to change this dynamic. Another problem with this is at scale, at the point where we are in our culture right now, central banks don't really understand what we're doing, right? Like, why did we have the financial crisis? Why did we have the Great Depression in the 20s, right? A lot of central banks were created as a response to the Depression in the 20s because there's something very broken about it, and people thought that would fix it. They thought that being able to provide more money, provide liquidity, as people would call it, would help. But it turns out this book is a really interesting one. It's about how the central banks are the only game in town, and they literally only have one tool. It's almost like they have a hammer, and everything looks like a nail. The one hammer they have is by making it cheaper when they lend money to the other banks, who then lend money to people. So right now, we're in a state where our economy is extremely imbalanced, because for years and years and years, all those central banks were lending out free money with 0% interest rate. So imagine if you had a credit card that said the interest rate is 0 and you can pay it back whenever. What would you do? You would go spend a whole bunch of money, and the idea is that makes our economy go faster, et cetera. But this book details, anyone who's thought about it deeply, I think, would detail to you the fact that this is a very broken idea. And at some point, it's going to blow up on us. A lot of people have suggested different ways of going about this, right? Different ways to challenge the sort of power structure that exists. This guy, Friedrich Hayek, is a Nobel-winning economist. He suggested the denationalization of money is one thing that you could do. A long time ago in Baltimore, with this gentleman right here and a number of other people, I helped work on creating a complementary currency called the Baltimore B note as sort of an experiment in this. That was right around 2008 when we were watching all of this sort of collapse. But what he suggested was that, in early days when people were issuing coins, you had to somehow know the value of the coin. You had to know whether this thing was actually gold or whether it was half gold and half something else or whatever, right? So one easy way to do that is you have Caesar issue the gold coin, and you just kill anyone who puts the Caesar stamp on it and who doesn't have the right concentration of gold, right? So that works pretty well. The problem is Caesar is always going to end up realizing, hey, well, no one else can do it, but I can do it. I can add a little bit of whatever else in there, and I can keep doing that, and then I can fund my nice social program, and I keep doing that. And what we end up with is the modern banking system, where we inflate money as a tax in order to pay for various government functions. Also, ending up with those central banks then lending that inflated money eventually to you and to all people, and then using all of their human consciousness to pay back something that those people made up. That doesn't seem like a very good value flow to me. So what Hayek suggested is that actually having competing currencies, having a whole bunch of different ways to print money, or money that had different functions and functioned in different ways or had different goals, was really the way to get a reflection of what humans wanted out of their money. What I think, though, is that money is really more malleable than it seems. Money is really a reflection of a mental construct, of a neurocognitive construct. And this quote, if you can read it, "Money is a mode of organizing our life in the material world. Money is an invention, a mental device, very necessary, very ingenious, but in the end, a product of the mind." There's a field called neuroeconomics, and I won't bore you with turning this into like a neuroscience lecture, but there's an interesting part of this paper right here. It says parts of the limbic system associated with the midbrain dopamine system, including the paralimbic cortex, are preferentially activated by decisions involving immediately available rewards. So dopamine is the thing that makes you feel happy, is activated when you get immediate rewards. Like, I give you $100 right now. dopamine lights up in your brain. In contrast, regions of the lateral prefrontal cortex and the posterior parietal cortex are engaged uniformly by intertemporal choices, irrespective of delay. So there's another part of your brain that computes the value of something, notably in a part of your brain that's normally thinking about executive functions, thinking about long-term planning, right? So there's this sort of like, there's this tension in your brain between, okay, this part of my brain, the front of my brain, the thing that thinks about like, how do I make sure I can eat in 6 weeks? That part of your brain is in tension with, how do I make sure I eat right this second, right? And so humans are actually very bad at thinking about the difference between getting something now and getting twice as much in a week. But the point I really want to make here, even though this looks really fancy and complicated, is that human beings, our nervous system is tied up with money. Human beings internally, we have an internal value system. Part of it might come from our society, part of it might come from the way that we were raised, our religion, moralities, but it's instantiated in this kind of neural code here. It's instantiated in things like dopamine, it's instantiated in things like reward mechanisms. And when the central bank is the arbiter of who gives money to whom, and how much money you're allowed to get for what kind of behavior, that's actually what's determining the structure of the economy. That's actually what's determining the structure of what a job is. And when parents teach their children, like, you better grow up and you better start a tech company so you can get lots of money, or you better go get some other kind of job and work your butt off for your entire life so that you can pay back up this pyramid hierarchy. Actually, what they're doing is they're lighting up this part of your brain here. We have the ability to create different meta layers above this, right? If you look at the internet, I would analogize the internet to almost like an externalization or a nervous system for Gaia. If you look at what human beings are doing, right? The human beings who are currently just turning all of the environment into little pieces of junk and trash and gadgets. If you look at the internet as the communication mechanism that allows us to do that, it's a little bit like we added another layer to our brain. It's a little bit like we added a faster communication mechanism that connects all of our brains. And if we think about what blockchain technology allows us to do, it allows us to change the dynamics of how your brain lights up according to value. It allows us to change the dynamics of how the actual value is flowing along that connection between all of your brains, and therefore changes the functioning of the nervous system of our planet. Nietzsche said money is the crowbar of power. One way you could think of it is that money is a force multiplier on almost any signal. So if in your brain a certain part lights up, your dopamine lights up, that's going to cause you to do a behavior. That's why drug addicts that do dopaminergic drugs do that behavior over and over again. Money is a little bit like at that meta layer of our planet. It's like a crowbar. It will cause mass swaths of humans to have their dopamine light up. It will cause people to behave in ways that you want. So what can we do? What can we do with a crowbar in the hands of a whole bunch of nice people, or at least a different group of people? What blockchain really does, interestingly, and the primary innovation of it, is it allows us to have a different model of trust in our society, right? And the interesting thing about rye stones is that it all relied on trust of the community. The fact that everyone knew that I had that rye stone and that I gave it to my neighbor, and the whole community agreed that I gave it to my neighbor, the fact that we all trusted each other is really the only thing that was the underpinning of that monetary system. The economists called Bitcoin the trust machine, or blockchain the trust machine, for that reason. Because essentially, all Bitcoin is, all blockchain is a way for us to trust each other and make agreements. This is a smart contract. I don't know if you can see it very well from all over the room, but this is on Ethereum. You can write pieces of code that are executed in a trusted way that no one owns and no one controls, so everyone can trust them. Just like in the community, no one controls the list of who owns the rye stones, so everyone can trust it because the community kind of maintains it. This is a contract that can execute on Ethereum in a way that everyone can trust. You could say everyone reaches consensus on what the state of the list is, and that's exactly what Bitcoin is. If you think of all the nodes, all the computers all over the world that are trusting each other, every 10 minutes in the case of Bitcoin, they all agree on the list of who owns what rye stones or who owns what Bitcoins, if you want to call it that way. They can all trust each other because no one owns it. Again, they can reach consensus, and maybe that's a new monetary system. Maybe that solves some of the problems that I talked about regarding the central bank hierarchy. But if you have smart contracts, which are pieces of code that can represent almost any piece of information, this could represent the way a stock market works. This could represent also shares of rainforests that are incentivized for you to buy and get monetary rewards according to the carbon credits captured by that, which is actually a project we're doing called Veridian, if you want to check it out. This could represent all kinds of different ways that our consciousness could actualize itself into the world based on money and based on logic. It could also be a new government. The only reason we need a government is to make sure that we have things like court systems that can make sure that we agree with each other, and we can implement things like monetary systems that we are protected in those things. Those things are all very expensive, but if the useful unit of those being administrated is no longer rightfully at the level of government, if we could just have something like a computer system that we can trust, maybe governments aren't as important, maybe they're not as needed. Maybe we can start to make things that are more sort of a reflection of deeper parts of human consciousness that are not a reflection of, say, lords and vassals fighting each other. Maybe this is a new nervous system for the planet. I would disagree a little bit with the idea that making money on these things is necessarily a zero-sum game, because what we're doing, what this is a list of a whole bunch of different cryptocurrencies and their market capitalizations. These are things that represent a project that we did where we funded the buying of the carbon credits essentially through buying rainforests, and that has a market cap now, or will have a market cap very shortly on Ethereum. These are all kinds of different representations of human consciousness. These are all kinds of different things that allow your brain to light up with dopamine and have the reward system that's internal to your mind be externalized into the world and be communicated and contracted with and dealt with regarding every other human around you. These are different models of economies that are popping up, and you can keep doing this over and over again until eventually it pushes out the old one. The thing that makes this all possible is something called public key cryptography. Basically, there's a public key and a private key. A private key is a number that only you have. A public key is a number anyone can have. Anyone who has your public key can verify that you had your private key, which means anyone who has my public Bitcoin address can verify I had a secret number associated with that Bitcoin address. And that's what lets me send Bitcoins. It's also what lets me sign smart contracts in Ethereum, et cetera. And this is like a random accident of mathematics. And humans, when we search for knowledge, it's a little bit like the professor with the light. If any of you guys have studied the philosophy of science, it's a common story that I love. The professor's walking home kind of drunk from the bar, and he's looking on the ground, and his grad students come and find him. And he said, "Professor, what are you doing looking on the ground here? And, is this where you left them?" And he says, "No, this isn't really where I left them, but this is where the light is." And I think that that's a good metaphor for how human consciousness's search for knowledge works in the world, and how science generally works. But for whatever reason, there was some light in some mathematician's mind that allowed us to find this really weird math that lets us do this. And somehow, that light has allowed us to create this thing that's going to change our economy dramatically and change the way that we can express our consciousness in this world. So I would suggest that actually these technologies are a strange gift from the universe that got inserted or downloaded into the human mind that allows us to make another step in the global consciousness that I hope we build. Thank you so much.